Hi guys, here we are with Chapter 24, the origin of species. We're going to kind of move up to a larger scale than what we were looking at in Chapter 23. Chapter 23 was primarily about what we might call microevolution. That would be the change in frequency of certain alleles, certain genetic components. And now we're going to kind of move up to what's going to lead us to macroevolution, which would be the change of species over time and the development of new species, and as a matter of fact the development of entire new categories of living creatures, like for example birds or amphibians or mammals. So kind of the gateway or the bridge between the microevolution that we were discussing in the last chapter and say the major categories of animals or creatures that we see today would be this macroevolution. This speciation is what we're going to talk about. So chapter 24 is all about the origin of species, and we'll get started in just 1 second. The chapter overview talks about Charles Darwin, of course, and his travels around the world, particularly in the Galapagos Islands. And there in the Galapagos Islands, what was unique about those islands was that they were geologically, they were fairly new or young. They were volcanic islands. They had been formed not as long ago as, say, the mainland portions. And he discovered some topography and geography and plants and animals and life there that you can't find anywhere else on Earth. They were endemic to that particular area. And he noted that both the islands and these creatures that he saw were relatively new or unknown in other parts of the world. He wrote in his diary, he kept copious notes, copious notebooks, and he wrote information and thoughts down all the time. In his diary he wrote, quote, "Both in space and time we seem to be brought somewhat near to that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on this earth," unquote. So he was talking about speciation, new species that have never been seen before, and he was talking about this idea of how this occurs. How does a new species arise? And that was all having to do with some of his writings with his famous book, of course, and his thoughts on the theory of evolution via natural selection. So that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter. If you go back and you look at the Galapagos Islands even today, I put some videos, if you go to the Chapter 24 folder, there's some videos in there, I think, showing some of the tortoises, and then there's other videos that I'll review later on in this vodcast. So in the Chapter 24 folder, there's a couple of few video clips you might want to take a look at. But there at the Galapagos Islands, you're going to find distinct geography and distinct types of animals that are unique to that particular area. And they are different species from, say, the mainland or other places that you might go around the world. And so this was his question. Was, for example, there is a flightless bird that looks very much like a cormorant that you might find on the mainland, but this one is flightless. And it's different from the ones that Darwin found on the mainland, but it's obviously related. And so he was trying to figure out, how does this new species come about? How does this bird that didn't exist anywhere else, how did it come to be on that isolated Galapagos island? So that's what we're going to talk about, speciation, and let's get a move on with our first intro. So before we get in too deep, of course, we need to review some quick vocabulary so we're all on the same page as far as vocabulary. The first word is speciation, which is the origin of new species. It is at the focal point of evolutionary theory. So evolutionary theory, for it to be strong and for it to be considered probable or likely or scientifically accurate, it must explain how new species originate and how populations evolve, and it does. Speciation is this bridge, like I mentioned, between microevolution, which is what we studied in the last chapter, just the change in allele frequencies in a population over time, and what we might call macroevolution, which is the broad patterns of evolutionary change above the species level. The origin of new entire groups of organisms such as mammals or flowering plants, and that happens through a series of speciation events. So we're kind of going from the very small, the microevolutionary mechanisms like mutation, natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, and we're going to move on to macroevolution in Chapter 25. So this chapter kind of explores the connection between those two. Here's a quick little video clip. You can right click and hit play, and this kind of discusses this idea of micro to macro evolution. So concept 24.1 says the biological species concept emphasizes reproductive isolation. Before we really get too deep into this, we need to understand what that word means, species. We need to establish what we're talking about when we say a species. And again, in biology, like in all the sciences, words and their definitions matter, and sometimes the definitions are not exactly the way that the common person might throw around the word. So we need to be very clear and discuss what exactly is a species. The word itself is a Latin word meaning kind or appearance, and when biologists consider something to be a separate species, they're going to compare a number of things about that organism, that living creature. Morphology, physiology, biochemistry, DNA sequences. They're going to use all of these to kind of group creatures into categories that we might call a species. We're going to find out that there are actually numerous ways to define this word species. Most people just think a species is one clear-cut definition, and it's pretty obvious that, you know, a dog is not a cat, and they're two different species, and that's all there is to it. But it's not like that. In biology, truthfully, there's a lot more gray, and this word species and these categories that we call species, they are defined by man. They were made up for us to make sense of the biological world around us, and it's not always as clear-cut as you might like to think. For example, if you go to the paint store, this is the example I commonly use. If you look down at this grayscale at the bottom right of the slide, if you look on the far left, this is obviously white. And if you look at the far right, that is obviously the color black. And black and white are obviously two different colors. That's clear cut. But the problem is there's a bunch of graduations in between. And at some point, the white becomes gray. And at some point, the gray becomes black. Where do we put those dividing lines? If you've ever gone to Lowe's or Home Depot to pick out, say, white paint for a house, your mind will be boggled by the 99 different types of white paint there are. Well, at one point that white becomes cream, or that white becomes gray, and then that gray eventually becomes black. It's hard to tell one paint chip from the other. You can choose the far white and the far black, and yes, they are obviously different. But what about in the middle ground? Well, humans like to categorize things, so we draw lines and we say this is white and this is gray and this is black. That's what we do with species of living creatures. But in truth, it's much more like this, where it's a graduation, and sometimes it's difficult to tell between one line and the next what is a clear-cut different species and what is not. And that's because that's the way evolution works. It's not just a stop and start white and black process. It's a gradual change over many, many millions of years, and you're going to see, for the most part, these graduations, which make it difficult. So keep that in mind when we're talking about species. It's not just, oh, it's a cat, it's a dog. They're obviously two different species, and one could never become the other, and that's all there is to it. No, that's not biology. That is what perhaps many common people think, but they don't understand the process of evolution over time and the speciation process. So that's what we're going to take a look at, and we'll get started here with the biological species concept, which is probably the one that most people are familiar with. The biological species concept is the concept that says if creatures cannot breed together, then they are two separate species. And again, there are multiple definitions of this word, but this is perhaps the most common one. So this states that a species is a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable offspring, viable fertile offspring. That's going to be an important point. And they do not breed successfully with other populations. For example, we can look at humans. You could take a New York businesswoman and a Mongolian dairy farmer, perhaps two as distinct humans as you're going to find, but if they were to meet and fall in love, they could have children, and those children could go on to have children, no problem. So they are of the same species. Compare that to, say, two creatures that live in the very same area, a Texas teacher and a Texas mockingbird. They live in the same geographic area, they live close to one another throughout their entire lives, but they are obviously two separate species. No matter how much in love they are, they could not create children and have those be viable offspring. So they're obviously two different species. So the biological concept of species says that if they can breed and produce viable offspring, they are of the same species, and those other populations they cannot breed with are separate species. And it's gene flow, something we discussed in the previous chapter, the movement of alleles between creatures. Gene flow between these populations of the same species holds the look and the phenotype of these populations together. So the opposite of that would be the absence of gene flow, and that is very much a critical factor in the formation of new species. So the absence of gene flow, we're going to see, plays a key role in the formation of a new species, and then a key role in keeping those groups apart once their potential to interbreed has been reduced. Now make sure you note that this biological species concept is based on the potential to interbreed. It's not based on physical similarities or geographic proximity. It's strictly based on can they breed together and produce viable offspring. At the top of the page here you see an eastern meadowlark right here on the left and a western meadowlark on the right, and they look, to my eyes, extremely similar. To me, I would say this is the same bird, it's the same species. They have similar body shapes, similar colorations, but they are distinct biological species, separate from each other, because their mating song and their behaviors are different enough that in the wild they do not interbreed. This bird will not interbreed with this bird. Their behaviors and where they live and how they act are just too different. So they will not interbreed, and that makes them a separate species, and they will not produce viable offspring. Then compare that to humans, where you have an amazing diversity. I mean, you have 6 humans here, none of them look exactly alike. They are spread throughout the entire world, so geographically they're quite separated as well. But any of these males and females could have a child together and it would be a viable offspring. So species is not based on, or this concept of species is not based on how much they look like each other or whether or not they live in the same area. It's simply, can they breed and produce offspring? One of the key factors in this speciation process is something called reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is the existence of some sort of barrier, some sort of biological factor that keeps the two species from producing viable, fertile offspring. Now sometimes you will have two different species that can breed together and can produce babies. These would be called hybrids, but generally you'll find that the hybrids themselves cannot go on to have babies, cannot produce viable offspring for a number of reasons. So you can have hybrids on occasion. Usually this is between two fairly closely related species, but you're going to find that then that becomes kind of a dead end. So that means that yes, sometimes species can interbreed, but that product cannot go on and continue breeding on its own. Reproductive isolation, we're going to find out, kind of comes in two different forms. It can either be some sort of isolation, some factor that acts before fertilization or after fertilization. So basically before the two try to reproduce and the sperm and egg join, or after that happens, there are two sets of factors here that can potentially keep that from going on. So we're going to look at reproductive isolation. We'll look at what we call factors prior to fertilization and factors after fertilization. If you look in your textbook on page 490 and 491, the text does a great job of laying out this whole double page of all these various reproductive isolation factors, and they divide them into what's called pre-zygotic and post-zygotic barriers. So we're going to look at the pre-zygotic barriers first. That would be the barriers or the factors that act before fertilization, and then we'll take a look at some of the post-zygotic barriers, which are the ones that occur after fertilization. So first up are the pre-zygotic barriers. They block fertilization from occurring in a couple of different manners. One of those would be from impeding the different species from attempting to mate. In other words, the two different species just never get together to mate for a variety of reasons at all. So mating never even occurs, and so you're not going to have any mixing of the sperm and egg from the two different species. The second one is perhaps the two species do meet together, but for some reason there is a barrier that prevents the successful completion of mating. And then the third one is hindering fertilization even if mating is successful. So in the first instance, they don't even get together. In the second, they do get together, but nothing can happen. And in the third, something can happen, but there is no result. These are all pre-zygotic barriers. We'll take a quick look at a couple of examples. First example they give is called habitat isolation. You can find that on page 490. It shows these two garter snakes, two species of garter snakes. They are separated not by like large land masses or geographic area, but really by habitat. One of these garter snakes primarily lives in the water, while another one lives primarily on land. So even though they're not really separated by physical barriers, they could get together They don't, because they have two separate habitats, and this guy is never going to run into this girl simply because of habitat isolation. So they're considered two separate species because of that. Whether or not they could interbreed in spring, they wouldn't be considered separate species, perhaps, if they could. So they may be able to interbreed as well, but that would likely produce a hybrid that may not be able to go on to breed itself. But they're not likely to do that just because they have two separate habitats. They're never going to run into each other, basically. The next prezygotic barrier is called temporal isolation, and this is usually based on time or habit. These two species of creatures that you see here, they are different types of spotted skunks. They are in the same, well, they have a range that overlaps, so potentially there is an area where they are both present and they could potentially breed, but because of temporal isolation they do not. They have different breeding seasons, so one of the skunks breeds in the spring and one of them breeds in the fall, or perhaps one of them is active at night, one of them is active during the day. So that's called temporal isolation, and that's going to keep them apart and keep that interbreeding from happening. A third example of a prezygotic barrier that simply impedes the different species from even attempting to mate is called behavioral isolation. So, for example, on the Galapagos Islands there are these birds called blue-footed boobies, and there are a couple different species of those, and they have certain courtship rituals, certain dances or behaviors that are unique to to a particular species. And so, say for example, you may have these blue-footed boobies, and if one of them doesn't do the correct dance, it doesn't attract the mate of the other. So their behavior causes them to be isolated, and they will basically ignore the other species of the blue-footed boobies because they don't act the right way. It's almost like when you think about middle school kids, where some of them are cooler than others, and the cool kids won't hang out with the dorky kids, or the band kids don't want to hang out with the jocks or something like that. That's really behavioral isolation, and you see that even in animals. That keeps them from interbreeding. Next up was a couple of examples of when the species do get together, but something mechanically or some physical barrier keeps them from mating successfully. So we have mechanical isolation, which is morphological differences that prevent successful mating. In the case of these two snails, different species of snails, they have a different spiral of their shell, a different shape of shell. That affects their ability to mate together because it affects the orientation of their sexual organs. So they may come together and they may attempt to mate, but they can't mate successfully because of these various morphological differences, these physical dissimilarities that keep that from happening. Another example of that, where they could potentially interbreed, but something keeps that from happening even when they attempt to interbreed, is called gametic isolation, relating to the gametes, of course. So this happens a lot in sea creatures. You have these sea urchins here, the red ones and the blue ones that you see. They release their sperm and egg into the water, and that sperm and egg combine there in the water, so it's just kind of released into the environment there. Well, there's certain proteins on the one variety and different proteins on the other variety of the various gametes that kind of keep those gametes from joining together very easily. So the sperm of the red sea urchin doesn't fertilize the egg of the blue sea urchin simply because of some protein differences on those gametes, and that's gametic isolation. So you may have an area where the sperm and egg of both varieties are released into the water, but you're not likely to get a mixing of the two. The next set of barriers were called postzygotic. So this means that the animals do successfully breed together, but there's going to be something that keeps that from being a fertile quality offspring. So postzygotic means the creatures maybe have an overlapping range, or they're similar enough that they can physically breed together, and they do breed, but then there's going to be something beyond that that keeps that from being a viable offspring. So we're going to look at that. It's called reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, and hybrid breakdown, and we'll look at a couple of quick examples. So postzygotic barriers prevent the hybrid zygote from developing into a viable fertile adult. So breeding was successful, but something's going to keep that hybrid from being successful. Let's take a quick look. The first one is reduced hybrid viability, and that is the genes of the different parent species interact and impair the hybrid's development. So the living hybrid can be born, but it's going to be of not a very good, say, genetic quality. It's going to be weaker or slower, or it's going to have various things about it that keep it from being as strong and having the ability to survive as well as the two separate species were. The next example is called reduced hybrid fertility, and this is commonly seen in agriculture or in farms and things like that. If you've ever heard of a mule, or if you've ever seen a mule, that would be here on the far right. A mule is a hybrid, and it's a very common hybrid. It's a cross between a donkey and a horse. A male donkey and a female horse gives you a mule. And mules are very strong. They are very well suited for survivability and work, and they have been used for hundreds of years in agricultural work and things like that. So in this case, the hybrid is quite vigorous, quite alive, quite healthy, but it is sterile. So even though it grows up to be usually larger even than both the male and the female that bred together, it is not itself able to produce offspring. So you couldn't take a male and female mule and then breed them together and get more mules. So every time you want a mule, you have to go back and breed the two separate species together that creates a mule, because the offspring itself is sterile. So that's reduced hybrid fertility. The last example is called hybrid breakdown, and it says some first generation hybrids are fertile, but when they mate with another species or with either parent species, the offspring in the next generation is feeble or sterile. So we see this in an example of some wheat plants here, where the hybrid can breed itself, but then its offspring tends to be very weak or very unstable, or not able to breed, sterile. So again, you're kind of leading to a dead-end path with this hybridization between the two species. So the biological species concept is probably the most common one. It's the one that most people are familiar with. When you say species to the common person, this is usually what they think of: creatures that can or cannot interbreed. And it's a very good definition. It's the one that we most widely use in the science world. But there are some limitations to this. And some of the limitations would be, for example, the biological species concept. You can't apply it to fossils. You have no idea when you're looking at fossils and you're constructing the remains of extinct creatures whether or not they could interbreed. So you can't really apply this concept to fossils. You also can't really apply this concept to asexual organisms, including all prokaryotes that divide differently and reproduce differently. Even prokaryotes have a way of passing genetic information between them, but it's not really part of the main reproductive process. So if you're looking at bacteria, how do you define what a certain species of bacteria is? Because they don't even breed together the way that sexual creatures do. So this definition does have some drawbacks to it. The biological species concept emphasizes the absence of gene flow, which is a very important concept, but gene flow can occur between distinct species. There are examples where gene flow does occur between distinct species. So the best example is between, say, a grizzly bear and a polar bear. There are living examples that have been captured, shot, hunted, found, where grizzly bears and polar bears, who are very separate, distinct species, they can mate, and that hybrid is a fertile bear, and it's sometimes nicknamed a growler bear. But here's an example. You can go click here and look at a link right there. They're either called growler bears or pizzly bears, depending on which one was the female and which one was the male. But here's a picture. This is a grizzly bear and a polar bear. They have some distinct morphological differences, and they have distinct separate ranges and habitats and diets and everything else. But there is some overlap, and they can breed together, and they can produce a hybrid growler bear that is viable and can reproduce itself. So these are two separate species, but here you see a factor that kind of throws into to the area of problem, this definition, this biological definition of species that we're talking about. So what we're going to take a look at next is perhaps some other definitions of species, and there are a few that emphasize other things. So that particular definition, the biological species definition, kind of emphasizes the differences between creatures, the differences between Group A and Group B. And now we're going to look at another definition or two that emphasizes the unity between Group A, or the unity between Group B. And these would be based on morphology, the morphological species concept. That's going to define a species based on its structural features, what it looks like, and its anatomy and things like that. That can be applied to sexual and asexual species, but it does rely somewhat on some subjective criteria. It's not always as clear-cut as you would like it to be. In practice, this is how scientists often distinguish a species, but there can be some disagreement regarding the grouping by structural features. Remember, I said that unlike what most people want to think, it's not always clear-cut, and there is some disagreement here, and that's part of science, is learning and adding to the discussion and redefining and more closely defining and clarifying what we're talking about. The other two that we'll look at briefly include the ecological species concept. That views a species in terms of its particular niche or its place in the ecosystem, where it lives, what it eats, how it interacts with other creatures. This can apply to sexual and asexual species, and it kind of emphasizes something we discussed in the last chapter, the role of disruptive selection that can separate creatures into two separate groups. And then last but not least, we'll talk briefly about the phylogenetic species concept. This defines a species as the smallest group of individuals on a phylogenetic tree. So kind of like one twig or branch of a phylogenetic tree that we might make on the tree of life. It applies to sexual and asexual species, but it can be difficult to determine the degree of difference required for a separate species. I mean, where do you decide, again, like those paint colors, where do you make the decision that you're going to draw a line here and say this is a separate species from this one, because sometimes they can be very close together, and that's difficult. Just keep in mind that this idea of species is a human definition, a human way of trying to make sense and organize the natural world around us. There are far more than what we've just discussed. There are more than 20 other different species definitions that we could use that have been proposed, and the usefulness of each definition kind of depends on the situation and the research questions that you're asking. For our purposes, when we're going to be talking about the rest of this chapter, we're going to keep on the biological species because that's the main one that most people know, and that'll be our main focus. So let's take a break. We'll come back in Concept 24.2 in just a second.